I used to think the sound of my own breathing meant everything was still under control. As long as I could hear myself inhale and exhale, as long as my chest rose and fell without effort, I believed there was time left to fix whatever I had postponed. Breathing felt like proof that life was still open, unfinished, waiting for me to get around to it. I didn't understand that breathing alone is not the same as living. There were mornings when I woke up already tired, not because I hadn't slept, but because my mind never truly rested. I would lie there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, calculating the day ahead before my feet even touched the floor. Appointments, responsibilities, promises made to others but not to myself. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, what responsibility demanded. When you are young, tiredness feels temporary. You believe rest is something you can schedule later, like a meeting you keep postponing because it doesn't feel urgent. I did that with my own life. I postponed joy. I postponed presence. I postponed the simple act of asking myself whether I was okay. Please don't skip this part. What I'm about to tell you isn't dramatic and it isn't heroic. It's ordinary, and that's what makes it dangerous. Most regrets don't come from big mistakes. They come from small choices repeated so often they become invisible. I remember a time when my hands were softer and my back didn't ache in the mornings. I didn't notice those things then. I only notice them now because they're gone. Back then, I believed my body would always cooperate, that strength was permanent, that energy could be borrowed from the future without consequence. As a child, my dreams were quiet ones. I didn't want to be famous or powerful. I wanted to be steady. I imagined a life where evenings were slow and familiar, where faces at the table never changed, where laughter didn't feel rushed. I thought that kind of life just happened naturally if you were a good person. No one explained that life doesn't drift toward warmth on its own. It drifts toward whatever you feed it most. And I fed mine urgency, pressure, and the constant belief that I had to prove my worth through effort. There was a moment early on when a different path was still visible. I could see it clearly, even if I didn't fully understand it. It was the option to stop chasing so hard, to accept less praise in exchange for more presence. I remember standing at that crossroads, feeling uneasy but choosing what felt safer. Safety is a convincing liar. It tells you that comfort now is smarter than fulfillment later. It tells you that sacrifice will be rewarded, that patience will be noticed, that people will understand why you're absent. I believed all of that without question. Years didn't announce themselves as they passed. They didn't knock. They didn't ask permission. They slipped by quietly while I was focused on staying afloat, on being dependable, on doing what I thought was expected of me. I measured my life in tasks completed instead of moments remembered. If you're still young, listen carefully. Time doesn't feel valuable when you think you have plenty of it. It feels abundant, almost wasteful. You spend it casually, assuming there will always be more waiting just ahead. I started missing things without realizing I was missing them. Conversations shortened. Invitations became less frequent. I was always almost available, always arriving late or leaving early, always promising to make it up later. Later became my favorite word. I told myself I was doing all of this for the people I loved. That narrative made everything easier. It softened the guilt and gave my exhaustion meaning. I didn't see how slowly, quietly, it was creating distance instead of security. There's a strange comfort in being needed for work. Work rarely rejects you. It doesn't get tired of you being distracted. It doesn't mind if you only give half of your heart, as long as your hands keep moving. I leaned into that comfort more than I should have. At some point, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. Not because I didn't care, but because it felt impractical. Wanting things that didn't fit into my schedule felt irresponsible. So I learned to silence that voice, and eventually it spoke less often. I don't remember exactly when I started feeling older. It wasn't tied to a birthday or a number. It was a feeling of being slightly out of sync with the world around me, like everyone else was learning a new language I hadn't practiced enough. One day, I caught my reflection and didn't recognize the tiredness in my own eyes. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was the weariness of someone who had been running for a long time without asking where they were going. I wish someone had told me this earlier. Being busy can feel like progress even when you're standing still. Movement without direction is exhausting, and it doesn't take you anywhere you meant to go. The older I got, the more I told myself I would slow down soon. Soon became a moving target. Every time I approached it, something else demanded my attention, my energy, my loyalty. I kept choosing obligation over intuition. There were moments of doubt, small and fleeting, a sigh that lingered too long, a sense of emptiness after an achievement I thought would feel bigger. I brushed those moments aside because they didn't fit the story I was telling myself. I believed that if I kept going, clarity would eventually arrive. That one day, it would all make sense. I didn't understand that clarity doesn't come from speed. It comes from stillness, and I avoided stillness whenever I could. Now, when I look back, I see how gently life tried to get my attention. Not through tragedy, but through subtle invitations to slow down. I declined them all, convinced I would respond later when things were less busy. This is only the beginning of what I need to tell you. As time went on, the invitations from life became quieter. Not because they stopped coming, but because I had trained myself not to hear them. I had learned how to move through days efficiently, how to check boxes, how to keep going even when something inside me felt off. Efficiency became my language, and emotion felt like an interruption. I started measuring my worth by output, by how much I could carry, by how little I complained. There was pride in that, a quiet one. People relied on me, and I told myself that being reliable was the same as being loved. It took me years to understand those two things are not the same. If you're listening to this while multitasking, please don't. This part matters more than you think. I want you to hear the subtle truth hidden in ordinary days because that's where most of life actually happens. Not in milestones, not in celebrations, but in the spaces between them. I remember moments that should have stayed with me forever, but didn't. Not because they weren't important, but because I wasn't fully there. I was distracted, thinking ahead, already planning the next obligation. Presence felt inefficient, so I rationed it. There were people who tried to reach me, not with demands but with patience. They adjusted to my schedule, accepted my absences, made excuses for me before I even had to. I mistook their understanding for infinite patience. I didn't realize patience has limits. The days blended together. Work days, weekends, holidays, they all carried the same weight, the same urgency. I lost the ability to tell them apart. When everything feels important, nothing truly is. At some point, I noticed that conversations had changed. They became shorter, safer. People stopped sharing the small details of their lives with me, not out of anger, but because I had taught them I didn't have the time. That realization came much later. I began to sense a distance I couldn't explain. I was physically present more often than before, but emotionally behind glass. I could see what I was missing, but couldn't reach it. It felt like arriving after something had already ended. I told myself this was normal, that this was what aging looked like. But deep down, I knew it wasn't age. It was accumulation. Years of choosing urgency over connection had stacked quietly, one on top of the other. I didn't notice when my body started keeping score. The tension in my shoulders, the shallow breathing, the way sleep stopped feeling restorative. I pushed through it all, convinced endurance was the same as strength. There is a lie we tell ourselves when we're overworked. That stopping means falling behind. That rest is a luxury reserved for later. I believed that lie with conviction. It kept me moving long after I should have paused. If you're still young, listen carefully. You don't feel the cost immediately. That's why it's easy to ignore. The bill comes later when your energy is lower and your options are fewer. I remember one specific evening that changed something in me. Not dramatically, not all at once. I came home tired as usual and realized no one expected me anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because they had learned not to. That silence was heavier than any argument could have been. It forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for years. I had been present in theory, but absent in practice. And love needs practice. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. Who would I be if I stopped performing? What parts of me had I neglected because they didn't produce results? Those questions lingered longer than I wanted. There's a strange grief that comes with realizing you can't go back to certain versions of yourself. Not because they were better, but because they still had time to choose differently. I mourned that quietly. I wish someone had told me this earlier. People don't remember how hard you worked. They remember how you made them feel, and feelings don't respond to schedules. I tried to adjust slowly, to show up more, to listen longer, but relationships are not switches you flip. They are gardens. Neglect leaves marks even if the soil is still fertile. Some people welcomed my effort. Others had already learned to live without it. That was one of the hardest truths to accept. Time doesn't wait for readiness. It moves on regardless. I began to feel my age not in my body but in my awareness. The awareness that time had shaped now. Edges, limits. It wasn't endless anymore, it was defined. That's when the fear arrived. Not fear of death, but fear of having lived incompletely. Fear of realizing too late that I had mistaken motion for meaning. I share this not to frighten you, but to be honest, because honesty is all I have left to offer, and because you still have choices that I don't. The fear didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, like dust on a shelf I hadn't cleaned in years. I noticed it in the way I hesitated before answering simple questions, in the way my thoughts lingered longer on the past than the future. I realized I was no longer planning far ahead. I was remembering. There's a moment in life when memory becomes more active than imagination, when what you've lived starts to outweigh what you expect. I didn't know when that shift happened, but once I felt it, I couldn't unfeel it. The future had become smaller, more fragile. I started paying attention to the details I once ignored. The way my hands looked different in the light. The way stares demanded more patience. The way silence felt heavier at the end of the day. These weren't dramatic changes. They were reminders. If you're still young, listen carefully. Aging doesn't announce itself with one big moment. It introduces itself through accumulation, through repetition, through all the times you told yourself, "Not now." I began replaying certain days in my mind. Not the important ones, not the big events, but the ordinary afternoons I rushed through. Days that felt insignificant at the time, but now feel irreplaceable. I wish I had known their value when they were happening. The realization that hurt the most was this: no one took those moments from me. I gave them away, freely, confidently, believing I would be rewarded with something better later. Work gave me structure, but it also gave me blinders. It narrowed my vision until I could only see what was directly in front of me. Everything else faded into the background, including parts of myself I once cared about deeply. I had hobbies once. Simple things. Things that didn't impress anyone. I stopped doing them because they didn't feel productive. I didn't realize how much of my identity was tied to those small joys until they were gone. There were conversations I avoided because they felt inconvenient. Talks that required patience, vulnerability, emotional energy. I chose efficiency instead. I told myself there would be time later to go deeper. Later arrived with conditions. Less energy, less openness, less opportunity. Emotional doors don't stay unlocked forever. Some close gently, others close for good. I wish someone had told me this earlier. The cost of waiting is not always visible immediately. It shows up in what you're no longer invited into, in what no longer feels natural. One day, I realized I had become very good at being alone. Not lonely, just solitary. I had adapted. That adaptation felt like strength until I understood what it was protecting me from feeling. There is a difference between independence and isolation. I crossed that line slowly without noticing. I called it maturity. I called it focus. I didn't call it what it was. I began to understand my age more clearly, not as a number but as a narrowing of time, of energy, of chances to repair what had been strained for too long. I tried to apologize, not with words at first but with presence, with listening, with effort. Some of it landed, some of it didn't. I had to accept both outcomes. Regret is not loud. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It asks quiet questions you can't escape once you hear them. Questions like, who were you when it mattered most? I started writing things down. Thoughts I never made time for before. Not because I planned to share them, but because I needed to face them. Putting them on paper made them real. There were nights I lay awake, not anxious, just alert, aware, thinking about how much of my life I had spent preparing instead of living, preparing for a future that arrived without ceremony. Please don't skip this part. The hardest truth I learned is that love needs attention, not intention. Wanting to care is not the same as showing up. I used to believe providing was my greatest contribution. Now I understand that presence was what was truly needed, and presence cannot be outsourced or delayed. I felt a deep sadness not for what I lacked but for what I misunderstood. I misunderstood time. I misunderstood love. I misunderstood myself. And then came the clearest realization of all, the one that changed how I see everything that came before. I realized that I had lived as if life were something to complete, rather than something to experience. That belief shaped every choice I made. Once I saw that, I couldn't look away. This is where the truth sharpens. The truth didn't come with relief. It came with stillness. A stillness that felt heavier than exhaustion ever did, because exhaustion kept me moving. Stillness asked me to sit with what was left undone. I saw my life differently then, not as a collection of achievements or failures, but as a pattern of postponement, of telling myself that meaning would arrive once things settled down. They never did. The most honest realization I had was this: I wasn't robbed of time, I traded it. I traded moments for momentum, connection for control, love for the illusion of security. No one forced me. I chose it again and again. That truth hurt because it gave me responsibility, and responsibility removes excuses. I couldn't blame work or circumstances or expectations anymore. I had to face myself without armor. I wish someone had told me this earlier. You don't wake up one day and suddenly feel old. You wake up and realize you've been living on autopilot for years. Aging just makes it impossible to ignore. If you're listening to this and thinking you still have time, you might. I hope you do. But time isn't something you possess. It's something you're allowed to borrow moment by moment. I began living more slowly, not because I planned it, but because speed no longer made sense. There was nothing left to outrun. Slowness became a form of honesty. I noticed things again: light through windows, the weight of a conversation, the way listening fully changes a room. These things were always there, I just was. Some relationships softened, others stayed distant. I learned to accept both with humility. Repair is not guaranteed, but effort still matters. It matters to the person you become. There's a quiet dignity in acknowledging where you went wrong, not to punish yourself, but to stop repeating the pattern. Awareness doesn't erase regret, but it prevents new ones. If you're still young, listen carefully. Your value is not measured by how much you endure. It's measured by how present you are. Endurance without presence is empty. I stopped trying to be impressive. I started trying to be honest. That shift didn't change my past, but it changed how I live with it. I don't have grand advice. I don't have a list of rules. I only have this truth, earned slowly and painfully. Don't wait for life to slow you down. Slow down on your own. Notice who's with you. Notice who you're becoming. Notice what you're sacrificing and why. If this story resonates with you, sit with it. Let it be uncomfortable. Growth often starts there. You don't need to fix everything at once. If you want to leave a comment, leave one for yourself. A reminder of what you felt listening to this. Sometimes words anchor intentions better than thoughts. And if you choose to subscribe, do it not because of me, but because these stories remind you to stay awake inside your own life. I thought working harder would protect me from regret. It didn't. It taught me how easy it is to miss what matters most. I'm older now, I move slower, but I see more clearly, and clarity, even late, is still a gift. If I could leave you with one thing, it would be this. Your life is not waiting for you to finish something else. It's happening right now. Don't let your silence be full of things you wish you had said. Don't let your days blur into proof instead of memory. That's the cost I paid. Thank you very much for watching. Leave your comment and tell us what your opinion is on these topics. Thank you for your attention. See you next time.